So first of all, welcome everyone to today's discussion on what makes good reporting. This event's been organised and will be chaired today by the IAS's land condition community. The topic of this webinar spans right across the environmental sciences. So today we're joined by representatives from all across the IES communities as well. To save me talking at you for too long, you'll be introduced to them as we go through rather than at the start. As always, there will be the chance for questions at the end of all of the presentations, so please do submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentations, and I'll then be able to put them to the panellists on your behalf later. So thanks everyone for logging in, and without further ado, I'll hand over to our chair for today, Andrew.
Hello, folks. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. All right, great. So just bring up that first agenda slide if you could. So yes, I'm Andrew Dower. I'm representing the IES here, Land Condition Community Chair. I also work for WSP. I'm a technical director with about 24-ish years of experience in the United Kingdom and in Australia, working on a vast array of sectors. Reporting, one of my favorite topics. So I'll be talking and just giving some fundamentals of good reporting, just a brief presentation, and then I'll introduce the discipline-specific presentations from about 12:15 onwards, and then we'll have some Q&A towards the end. So my presentation really is on the key aspects required to deliver reports. Without going into detail, but it's around making sure that that we've got that discipline and the planning works well. And I expect most organizations have got their own report writing templates or style guides, all that sort of stuff. So I'm not going to go into that or contradict anything or reinvent the wheel on any of that. I'm sure you've got that within your own organizations. And I'll leave it over to the discipline leads to provide some specifics on their area of interest. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just a bit of a reminder of the importance of great reports. So the report is a culmination of all the great work that you've done on a project. It could be weeks that you've been working on a project, months, or on occasions it can be years as well. And that could be office-based work, it could be field work, all sorts of different things that we work really hard on. And it's important to continue that fantastic work into the reporting phase. I know, from a consultancy point of view, I know how easy it is to then flick onto the next project as soon as that project work or the site work has been completed. But no one will really remember that great site work or the great comms that you had with the client or all the great planning sessions, because the thing that'll be the record in time will be that report. So you owe it to yourself to make sure that great work continues through, and you'll be surprised over the years the amount of reports that you write that will probably crop up in future. I was looking at a report not long ago that I'd written almost 20 years ago. So yeah, they do sit there and can be dug out in the future. So yeah, you want to make sure that they're absolutely top notch. And a good project really allows a project to progress. You want to produce a report for your client or your stakeholder that means that they can actually take the next step and you can meet those objectives and you can go forward. Of course, there's avoidable consequences that we want to be looking at here: budget, maybe legal implications if a report's not quite right. There could be a client that's not particularly happy. That actually looks like one of my clients from a previous consultancy, but I'm glad to say they never looked like that. But yeah, and I think the main one really is that kind of the time management thing. So it shouldn't be the norm that you're going home late, getting home late to see your family and all that sort of stuff. That on occasions that sort of seems to happen, but it shouldn't be the norm. That should be really an outlier, and good planning means that's the sort of way it should be going. I do appreciate that during busy times, that's the kind of key area where we need to really be thinking about our reports, because that's when that quality is not there. Next slide, please. So starting well. So how do we make sure that we really nail that report from the start? So I think having a report writing meeting, it's so easy to we have meetings throughout projects, but then we don't seem to meet frequently to actually work out what we're actually going to produce. So, again, looking at what's happened, what was your original brief? What was the proposal? As I say, it might be weeks, months, or even years since you actually wrote that proposal or you wrote the brief as to what you're trying to do. So, have a look at what was in there. So, really, it will really focus your mind. I would say that, good project managers should be looking at that proposal regularly throughout the delivery of their work, or to see where they're up to make sure that they're kind of staying on track. Considering your audience is really important. So, are you talking to are you communicating with a local resident, a nuclear chemist, somewhere in between? The default I always use really is trying to pitch it at the level that a GCSE science student could understand. I've always sort of thought that that's a good level in terms of knowledge, because we do quite often present very technical information, but the real trick is to try and present it using non-technical language, and that is a skill, because I think particularly since going to university where you're almost encouraged to write in a technical manner, you then get into the real world and it sort of flicks to being something different, where you need to communicate with a wide range of stakeholders with a wide range of technical expertise. So consider your interdisciplinary needs as well. So your piece of the jigsaw puzzle might just be one of the one element. It could be, you could have geotechnical folk, you could have all sorts of different people and all sorts of different disciplines in engineering or other that you're working towards. So will your report communicate well within that report? Are you communicating with the folks within that so they understand what their brief is? Define your role on a project as well. So most companies will have 3 tiers: an author, a checker, an approver. Some have more, but make sure you know what your role is going into that report. So that really makes sure that there's no tasks that fall between desks. A classic would be, on a consultancy report, might be who checks the actual data, who goes and does a deep dive of that data and does sense checks of the data as well. I think the one that I've sort of seen most over my years is people being probably too optimistic with the amount of time things take. So, I sort of given it, without going into too much detail, give an example of a project that I worked over on in Australia, where we had project managers that were allowed to set their own deadlines by our client, but then regularly that missed their own deadlines. So that was difficult, because you're kind of setting yourself up for failure, really. So just really be realistic and perhaps even slightly pessimistic with the amount of time, building any contingency that you might need. And we're all very busy, so delivering as a team is important, particularly when we're booking, got countless number of tasks to do each week. So if we've booked in time for the next tier of your review to look at something, if that document's not ready at that stage, then it may well have a knock-on effect into the next for the next person that needs to review it. So just deliver as a team is a key message, I think. Okay, next slide, please. So have a look at at the start of a report, have a look at your style guide, try and understand how your organization writes things, how it presents things. It could be trivialities, about or what might be seen as trivialities about bullet points and lists and all that sort of stuff, but it might be how you refer to your own organization, all that sort of stuff. Get all of that kind of administrative and grammatical kind of stuff cleared out. Have a look at templates, all that sort of stuff, so that doesn't happen during a report, because it's a lot of inefficiency with that. If possible, use figures and tables. I think we'll talk about that in one of the presentations a bit later on. Does your report read well? Can you push some of that technical information, the real technical detail, can you push that into an appendices? Be chronological. That would be the default for me. Most stories have a start, a middle, and an end. Describing something from start to finish is a good way for people to comprehend things. If you are going to do an executive summary, which I tend to advocate for, try and avoid, use that exec summary well and write it during your authoring of the report. If you leave it till the very end, often it can be rushed, and that's actually probably the first thing that the reader is actually going to look at, is that exec summary and maybe the figures, that might be the only thing that they look at. So you've really got to give that as much time as you need to do, and avoid mini summaries throughout the report as well. Just try and let that report flow, and that's all around having a good structure, which can be worked on during that report planning session. You might want to have a look during your well, first of all, say we quite often will, as consultants anyway, we will try and make conclusions based on only parts of bits and bobs of information, which is the nature of consultancy, I think. But we need to just be making decisions on good quality data as much as we possibly can. And if there is a situation where you don't have that quality of data, then this is where this sort of regroup might come in, whether it's with your team or potentially with a client, to try and talk about what that data gap might mean. If it means that the report or the project can't meet its objectives, it would be better to call that out during an actual, the authoring of the report or the preparation of the report, because there might still be something that can be done about it. Maybe it's extra data from the field, maybe it's something else, but what we're trying to do again is that objective is to try and get a report that means that you can take, or the client can take, the next step in the project. So to have a think about re-engaging during the process of putting together a report to see where you're up to, and manage change well. I think that's something that's really important. So there could be design change, it could be lab delays, there could be a client related or a site access related delays. I think certainly as consultants, we're very optimistic, and we'll try and stick to timeframes when there could be a legitimate reason to actually to push that date. So it's better to try and manage that and manage expectations during, as opposed to putting yourself under huge amounts of pressure for when you've got legitimate reason to move dates to the right. So if you flick onto the next slide, please. Okay, yes. So if you are authoring a report, it becomes very easy for you to sort of not really be able to read it anymore. You're that close to it. You can't really give that kind of impartial view as to what that report looks like. So I often find that if authors should be trying to really, if at all possible, sleep, have a sleep before you pick up the report again to review it when you're doing your check. Obviously strong cup of coffee, but also think functions like the read aloud function is really good. It really does pick out things that perhaps your eyes don't see when you've been been so close to a report. So have a think about using those sorts of that sort of approach. So first of all, check your own work, but then also have others check it. And all reports all deliverables need a peer review. So it doesn't matter whether you've got 2 weeks, 2 years, or 20 years experience. All reports need that fresh pair of eyes look. It's absolutely essential. So make sure that review process does flow through. I've just put a couple of things there on. This was something from a consultancy when I worked in Australia. I'd sort of gauged the opinion of a lot of the technical directors, and as to what they thought they would, or what they would like to see in reports when they review them, and what the reality was. And you can see there that they would hope only to be spending their time 5% of their time fixing maybe the odd error here and there, and most of their review would be on client messaging and technical review. But the reality was that maybe 40% of the work that they were doing, or the time that they were spending, was actually on fixing errors. So that the aim is to get towards that left-hand chart there, and have a think about that when you're producing report and before it goes out the door. Document your reviews as well. It's a quality step to make sure that there's various different ways you can document that you've had the reviews done, but that's hugely important. Not only because if you get audited, but more importantly, really, in my opinion, that it's you've got a defendable report should that need to be drawn upon in later times. Be proud of your report, and happy to defend it for when for if there is any challenge that comes back on it. So I think I've just got one more slide. Yeah, this is just about the future of reporting. So obviously AI is becoming a daily part of life. Now, digital data collection, desk studies, screening tools, all that sort of stuff has been around for a while, but we're starting to see now in the industry and across various industries that drafting sections of reports or proposals can be done with AI, but I would say very much that should be treated with caution. It should be used as perhaps the likes of Copilot, etc., as a bit of an aid or a starting point to understand, maybe looking at report content or structure and words and all that sort of stuff. But really, it has to be used wisely because obviously AI, there's caveats within the AI about whether it's factually accurate and all that sort of stuff. But you also got to get the balance between whether you're producing text and then the text only takes moments to produce, doesn't it, really? But then are you going to spend half an hour trying to make it sound like you want, or would it be better to actually just write it yourself type thing? So yeah, you just got to get a balance right and just treat AI with caution where you can. And yeah, just our role as IES members. So, environmental issues are gaining increasing attention, whether it's climate change, whether it's PFAS. And I think our role is becoming ever more prominent with the general public. So our reports must be accessible, non-technical, non-emotive, and we really got to try and focus on communicating technical concepts, factually and accurately, and I think that's a real challenge, particularly with some of the media you see and some of the attention that some topics get. So we've got a real important role of just being factual and just being accurate with what we produce. So I think that was about it. So we might flick over to David Carr. I'll just give a quick introduction whilst the slides are coming up there. So David Carr is a National Contaminated Land is in the National Contaminated Land Officers Group. He's a lead officer in the Environment and Community Protection Team at Dacorum Borough Council, with responsibility for land contamination and environmental permitting and involvement in local air quality management. He has over 20 years of experience as a local authority regulator in those fields, having previously worked for an environmental consultancy for 6 years. Over the past 20 years, he's been involved in numerous contaminated land regime Part 2A projects and reviewed hundreds of land contamination risk assessment reports submitted in support of planning. So, David, over to you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. So yeah, as indicated, this will be a regulator's perspective of good environmental reporting. And my work within environmental health has mostly involved land contamination. So this short presentation, while not delving into much detail, will be considering land contamination reporting more than anything else, and be focusing on reporting for the planning regime rather than the Part 2A regime, although hopefully most of the observations will be applicable to both. Next slide, please. So we start with what good environmental reporting looks like. So aims and objectives need to be clearly identified. This makes sure it's stating the obvious, really, but it makes sure that everyone is on the same page right at the outset, particularly regulator and consultant producing the report. It's then important to be very clear about who has prepared and reviewed the report alongside their qualifications. A requirement of the National Planning Policy Framework is that adequate site investigation information is provided and it is prepared by a competent person. So do be clear about who, the person that's done the work. Do they have recognised relevant qualification, sufficient experience in dealing with the types of pollution that they're working on, and also membership of a relevant professional organisation. Awareness of your readers, something that Andrew spent some time explaining as well. There's always more than one person reading it. It becomes slightly more important, I think, probably in a Part 2A setting when there's a high likelihood of members of the public being involved. But the balance, the aim is to be sufficiently technical to satisfy the regulator, but equally understandable to people that aren't perhaps involved in the detail of it. Might be a client, might be ground contractors, or someone from a different discipline, or indeed the public. Logically structured, it speaks for itself, hopefully. And then from a contaminated land perspective, clearly defined outline or clearly defined conceptual site model, obviously outline conceptual site model as an endpoint for a Tier 1 report, and as a starting point for a Tier 2 report, which will then need to be updated at the end of that Tier 2 report onwards in terms of a more detailed confirmed conceptual site model. Next slide, please. Important to reference the up-to-date standards and guidance, and then to correctly use those standards and guidance. Often seen lots of guidance listed at the front of a report, but then no subsequent sort of acknowledgement or use of it in the actual production of the detail. So spend a bit of time making sure that's all up to date. Might be reference to LCRM, British standards, statistical guidance. We'd expect to see a full, transparent justification for actions taken and decisions made. This sort of thing is vital to justify all manner of decisions, whether that's scope of a site investigation, decisions about whether to progress from generic to detailed quantitative risk assessments, justification for input parameters if you're going to be doing bespoke modelling, and justification for what remediation might be needed, if any, as a set of examples of the sorts of things we'd need to see fully justified. Acknowledgement of areas of uncertainty or insufficient data. This is an important one for a regulator. It might be linked to physical restrictions to areas of the site you can access. It might be an acknowledgement that additional phases of work will be required following your interpretation of results you've received. And it might even be an acknowledgement, albeit one not necessarily within the report, that there's a need for specialist support, whether that's subcontracting work to somebody else with a different skill or a discipline, but just identifying where you have uncertainties, insufficient data, or maybe the need to go to a third party to support the production of that report. Bullet points 9, 10, and 11 don't need much explanation, I don't think. So we've talked about conceptual site models before. Make sure they are updated in accordance with the information you've collected during your site work. Provide complete and comprehensive supporting information. Technical appendices are essential, and at the end of that report, make unambiguous conclusions and recommendations for further work. So next slide, please. How to achieve that? Clear and honest communication with your client. It's essential to establish those aims and objectives and the ultimate purpose of the report. But there may be occasions where the client needs to hear the reality of a situation too, and that might have to change as you progress through different tiers of reporting. Thorough research at the outset. There are many sources of information readily available that can set things off on the right foot. For example, information held by local authority environmental health departments, planning history of sites held by the LPA, knowledge of the owners and the occupiers of the land, and even information held by a client and their other specialists. Try not to work in a silo. Even if you are lucky enough to work in a company that has lots of things in-house, they might be in different departments, and you'll typically be part of a larger project team. So, pay attention to the drainage experts, foundation designers, landscapers. All of these are likely to have an impact on understanding your pathways, and may have implications on the remediation design that you're proposing. So be aware of their work and how they may or may not support your work and recommendations. Fourth point I've got listed here is don't leave any questions unanswered or issues unaddressed. A regulator should be asking questions constantly when they're reviewing a report, and any questions that they still have at the end of a review are likely to result in a requirement for more onerous planning conditions or an objection to a discharge of a planning condition. So bear this in mind. It doesn't mean that an author needs to know everything, but they need to acknowledge and have a plan to deal with what they still don't know, or justify why that isn't relevant anymore. And then the final point on this slide is to ensure consistency and continuity within reports and also from phase to phase. So within a single report, the executive summary needs to be consistent with the body of the report, which needs to match the conclusions and recommendations and be supported by the technical or evidential appendices. The same applies when moving from one phase of reporting to the next. Make sure issues, pollutant linkages, considerations identified in one report don't disappear in the following report. So what that means, or what environmental reporting should mean, is that you have a satisfied regulator, which will mean reduce delays with development, save time and money for you and your client. Trust established between the regulator and report author going forward. That's particularly important within the land contamination field, where reporting tends to get more complicated as the site investigation and quantitative risk assessment stages progress. So getting off on that good foot and establishing trust right at the outset is very helpful. And all of that should mean a satisfied client at the end of the day. And that's the end of my presentation. So I will just hand back to Andrew now. Thank you.
Smashing. Thanks, David. So Oliver is next. So whilst those slides are being brought up, I'll just introduce Oliver. So Professor Oliver Griefson is an Associate Director in Regulatory Monitoring at Atkins Realis, as well as being a Royal Academy Engineering Visiting Professor in Digital Water at the University of Exeter. Oliver is a multi-award winning technical leader in regulatory monitoring, helping clients with issues around water and wastewater monitoring. So over to Oliver.
Thank you, Andrew. No slides from me. I'll just talk as I go along. I'm going to come at environmental reporting from a slightly different perspective. I obviously work in the water industry, and some of you will have seen the Cunliffe report. Some of you will have seen the government white paper, which recently came out, which basically asked for open data. A lot of the reporting, certainly in wastewater performance nowadays in the water industry, is live. Quite a lot of it is we've got to report what's happening within the environment within 1 hour. It's a massive challenge. If I go back 20 years, a lot of the wastewater that pass through wastewater treatment works, it was reported at the end of each year, at February. You've got roughly 3,500 wastewater treatment works that are required to report under their environmental permits, about 6,500 which are too small and don't. But it was all about how much wastewater do we treat in an average year. Why was that important? It was for growth, how we planned for growth, how we planned for wastewater treatment works to get bigger, and of course how we planned for, say, the government's objectives now in terms of more housing. All that requires that infrastructure for everything to happen. Then about 10 years ago, there was a ministerial direction, and I think unless you've hidden your head in the sand, everyone's pretty much seen what's happened with the wastewater industry with event duration monitoring. So February is actually traditionally an incredibly busy month for all of the water companies as they prepare all the data from the previous year and report that and send that across the Environment Agency. And by the end of March, the Environment Agency and DEFRA published that in that annual report, and you'll see the newspapers say X amount more spills and this amount more hours. Of course, nowadays that's also reported online. I don't know how many of you have seen the National Storm Overflows Hub. That feeds a lot of reports. That feeds a lot of apps. So surface sewage, for example, have an app to show people where the coastal water quality. That's all fed from water company data. So how, when you do that environmental reporting, how in terms of those EDMs, do you put that check and approve process in place? Well, a lot of that is about governance of data. It's the governance, it's taking that step back and going, how do I make sure my data is right? A lot of that's maintenance. A lot of that's having a quality control system sitting behind all of that environmental data and making sure what goes out to the public is as correct as we can get it. If you go on the National Storm Overflows Hub, it will say down the bottom, this data is, I'll paraphrase, this data is as good as we can get it, but don't necessarily rely on it. But also when it goes out to the public, we've said this, how do we allow the public to understand what's happening? Especially if it's rapid reporting happening within an hour. The amount of monitoring that we're having to do in the wastewater system now is getting more and more and more. The National Storm Overflows Hub at the minute takes individual points within individual catchments across the country, roughly 14,500 data points reporting every hour. How do we make that understandable? How do we communicate to the public? How do we do the environmental reporting? But also, how do we bring that in? And hopefully when we start getting into the government white paper, we'll be able to produce a more holistic picture that people, that users of the water environment can understand. Is it just storm overflows? Is it a green or a red dot that tells somebody if it's safe or not safe to use that water recreationally? And that is all about, yes, it's reporting, but it's also information. It's also communication to people. As we get more and more points, how do we communicate that properly in an open way? Now, if you look into Section 81 of the Environment Act, the duty is there to report it in an easily communicable way for people to understand. And that's an important challenge that the water industry is facing. The other challenge, of course, at the minute, the reputation of the water industry isn't good. So how do you give people the trust in what they're looking at? We're also going to be communicating lots of different things in lots of different ways, but also there's a lot of citizen science work. How does the water industry come together with the citizen scientists to really bring a holistic picture of a holistic environmental situational awareness as it is? And that's, okay, environmental reporting from a slightly different angle, but live. And in doing that live within 1 hour, there lies a real challenge. But how do we communicate that environmental reporting in a live manner? How do we achieve open data? And at that, I look forward to some questions a little bit later, but I'll hand back to Andrew.
Smashing. Thanks, Oliver. So we're going to, I'll introduce Sarah Horrocks next, just as the slides are coming up. So Sarah has a degree in chemistry. Sarah spent a year at NPL in the air quality standards team. After that, she completed a master's in environmental technology at Imperial College and subsequently joined Atkins Realis. Sarah is the practice manager for air quality and has been with the company for over 20 years. She is also vice chair of the Institute of Air Quality Management. Okay, over to Sarah.
Thank you very much. And hot off the press, I am now the IAQM chair, which is very exciting. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I lead the air quality practice at Atkins. As you said, I've worked in consultancy for many years, and in that time, I've had the pleasure of writing and reviewing hundreds of reports. So yeah, it's great to be here, talk about something I really care about, but at times can still wrestle with, and that's how to make reporting genuinely good. And I do get through the red pens, but just as importantly, genuinely inclusive. And I just wanted to highlight that the IQM's code of conduct here, that professional integrity, we must maintain professional integrity at all times and be guided by the principle of applying the most appropriate science and practice. And that kind of requires our members to display objectivity and refrain from being selective or partial when presenting data or facts for written report or also in oral form. So this really does pervade our whole membership. Next slide. So I am here with my air quality hat on. Those of you who work in this field know, and as this diagram illustrates, we're not short of complexity or acronyms, which does make for challenging reporting. We sit in a really interesting space. It's technical, it's scientific, it's highly regulated, it's also incredibly human. Is what we do, what we assess affects people's health, their environment, and the places that we're all trying to protect. Because of that, the way that we communicate matters just as much as the modelling or the monitoring behind the scenes. What I do still find challenging even today is writing for multiple audiences. So our reports get read by planners, regulators, other technical disciplines, community groups. Some of those readers want the detail, others want reassurance and clarity. So finding that balance. So what I try to advise my team is to adapt their style for the intended audience as best as possible. That might sometimes mean doing 2 separate reports. It might mean producing FAQs. But yeah, it's a very emotive topic at times. And that's very important that we always keep that in mind. Next. So what do we report? I think Andrew has covered this pretty well, but our air quality assessment reports will need to capture multiple pollutants. We have different spatial and temporal scales, direct and indirect effects, secondary reactions, local, regional impacts, get the violin out please, public health, amenity, nature, even materials. There's qualitative and quantitative analysis to determine construction, operational, and sometimes decommissioning effects. As a result, there may be multiple and valid approaches to conducting the study. So it's really important that we explain the reason for those choices that are made, be that for the monitoring equipment, the software, the source of input data, guidelines, guidance used to determine significance. So for modelling, that might mean explaining what the scenarios are that you've chosen with and without the scheme, with mitigation measures in place, all the reasoning behind the phases that you've considered, and therefore how you've reached your judgment. Monitoring reports should consider different health criteria. That might be short and long-term exposure, any exceedances of those, the extent of the exceedance, and the actions proposed or taken to address them. Just going to add a quick word on quality assurance. It can feel like a dry topic, but it is what guarantees our credibility. So making sure that methods align with guidance, models verified, assumptions documented, internal checks and balances have happened, and that the competencies of those people are clear, gives decision makers confidence in what you're reporting. So do include a record of what's been undertaken, and for environmental impact assessment, you would also need to state the competency of those in those roles. Final point on this slide, it is essential to ensure consistency across different topics, especially if you're part of a multidisciplinary study. For air quality, our outputs feed into ecology chapter, health chapter, sometimes climate. Our inputs come from other chapters as well. So ensure that you are using the most up-to-date version. So communication across the different topic leads is essential. Otherwise, you may receive technical challenge and your competency will be questioned. And that you definitely want to avoid that. Next. How we report on air quality, others have said a good report will have a logical flow. It will narrate how and why an assessment was undertaken. The structure is key. That will determine whether your assessment findings and the reporting helps a decision maker and a stakeholder or just plain confuses them, especially when professional judgment, which IQM does require of its members, is used to interpret findings. Our reports are technical. We use lots of acronyms and it can get dense very quickly. We need to think about how to manage that complexity, make it as easy as possible to keep reading, not get lost in a maze of legislation, units, monitoring techniques, etc. We've talked a lot about using plain English. That doesn't mean oversimplifying. It's about opening the door to people so that they can follow what you've done and be engaged by it. And it's important that this isn't transactional and actually explain what's going on. So a good report will define technical terms clearly and any acronyms, and I do recommend sticking to similar terms throughout. We want consistency. We don't need this second mention approach to complicate things. And Amy, if you click now, we don't want any striped equids in our reports. We just call a zebra. Using tables, graphs, maps, photos, all of that to illustrate the main points will break down that complex information, make it more accessible to different groups of readers, including technical peers. Quite often, if I have to do a third-party review, I want to understand the methodology quickly. I might not have that much time. I need to see the assumptions. I need to understand compliance, evaluate whether or not mitigation measures are appropriate. So not everything needs to be center stage. Don't be afraid to put details like model performance, large tables of input data, put that in appendices. In the main body, use bullet points, flowcharts to break up the information, make it more quickly assimilated by the reader. You don't want to overwhelm your stakeholders. You want to inform them. And any reports that, even if unintentionally, appear to exclude key voices, face higher social and ecological costs down the line. Finally, and I won't go on any more slides, Amy, just wanted to say I'm a big believer in the power of a strong executive summary, something that pulls out the main key points from the baseline, method, results, conclusion, to support the communication of your key points. This should be written for a non-technical audience and able to stand alone as a separate document. And I think that's my time up.
That's smashing. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so we're going to move on to Eleni now, and just while the slides are coming up, Eleni is a project environmental lead for aviation and infrastructure projects with more than 20 years experience in leading environmental impact assessments and environmental management of strategically significant aviation and infrastructure projects across the UK and internationally. Eleni is the Vice President of the Institute of Environmental Sciences, where she has helped shape the organisation's strategy since 2016 and established the EIA community, which she now chairs. Over to you.
Hello, thank you very much, Andrew, and nice to be here. So I'll have a slightly different take from the presentation so far. When we were invited to discuss what makes a good EIA report, I decided the best presentation would really be to consult the EIA community and our EIA steering group. So thank you to everybody who responded to our questionnaire. This is a bit about my background. One second. Which I think you've already summarized, but I don't need to go over it again. But the main thing is that I have spent quite a lot of time as a technical reviewer for clients and consultants reviewing EIA reports. So this is based partly on my own professional experience and background in EIAs of infrastructure projects. So earlier on, when we launched the EIA community back in 2021, we produced a guidance document called Competence in EIA, which you can find on our website, and I can also send a link to anybody who's after it. And this set out what the different roles are within an EIA, because we'd realized that this hasn't really been set out in guidance for the UK. So starting from a project manager, EIA coordinator, topic specialist, and on the regulation side, a reviewer. And it's a really useful document that sets out what competence in EIA should be in accordance with the EIA regulations. In November, I set out a questionnaire, which I sent out to the EIA steering group and later on to the EIA community. So I should say that these questions are obviously biased by my own opinion of what I think makes a good EIA. But it was really interesting to read everyone's responses and how common the responses are and how much we all agreed. So the questionnaire looked at 5 broad topics. The first questions were really about what is the current state of EIA reports in the UK and how professionals feel about the ownership of these reports. Then one question was about the priority when you're starting out on working on an EIA report. Then we asked, what are the common pitfalls that you think exist within an EIA? And what do you recommend to overcome these pitfalls? And then the final question was about what are the main qualities for a good EIA report? So in terms of the current baseline and what we think, what people perceive to be the quality of UK EIAs, most people responded to say that there is an inconsistent standard across the UK, and there is a range of high quality to sort of average. No one actually responded to say they thought the standard is very low and needs to be improved, which I would agree with. And a few people did think that the technical standard is excellent in general, but most people thought there is room for improvement. The second question was, I was quite interested in the responses. It's clear that environmental professionals feel an ownership over their reports. They don't feel like they write a report and it sits under the consultancies or the client's logo and they're completely detached from it. They do feel like they have ownership over the documents they produce. And most people felt quite proud of the work that they produced, but some people did feel that if they had more time, looking back, they could have improved their reports. So the next question was really about what is the starting point when you work on an EIA, whether you start off looking at the design or understanding the constraints or the environmental baseline or the construction. So it was quite interesting that environmental professionals first need to get their head around the design and then to start looking at what the environmental constraints are. And following that, understanding the baseline and the monitoring and sort of the construction program came last for most people. In terms of the most common pitfalls, these are just a few of the comments people put, not all of them. There was quite a variety of responses based on individuals' experience. They have quite a broad range of pitfalls, but I sort of grouped them into a few different groups. So the most common thread was inconsistencies throughout the reports. So when you read the different reports, you can find inconsistencies in the assumption and inconsistencies across operation and construction assumptions. And then the different chapters using different terminology, especially when it comes to talking about effects and receptors or calling them impacts and so on. The second sort of strand was, again, misunderstanding the design and construction and not having very clear communication between the design team and the environmental team. The other strand was poor readability, which I think a few people have mentioned already in their presentations. So having too much technical language and jargon, meaning that the lay reader doesn't quite understand what you're trying to say, especially if it's gone out to public consultation, or exaggerating a non-significant effect. So an impact might be quite important to like a professional assessing that topic, but within the report they over-report an impact that's not actually that significant. The other issues that people identified are the ones we're all quite familiar with. So not assessing cumulative impacts, which is an ongoing issue that has been around at least since I started working on EIAs 24 years ago. Not having good enough quality assurance. Quite often that's down to not having enough time in the program. Not having a good solid design freeze, and this comes up repeatedly in people's responses. As we're all aware, you have a design that keeps changing, and some chapters may end up assessing an earlier version. And another theme that came up in a few of the responses was not assessing climate change impacts sufficiently in the reports. So then we asked, how do you think we can avoid these pitfalls? And there was quite a lot of recommendations that came up. Again, I tried to group these, and you can also, when I finish, I can share this presentation and you can study the individual responses a bit more if you like. Communication is really key. It came up repeatedly in all the responses we received. Communication between the project managers, the environmental coordinators, and also the topic specialists as well, and the clients. Liaising with the stakeholders, being well organized, picking up any environmental constraints from the beginning of a project rather than identifying them, towards the end or halfway through when it's too late. Scoping, improving scoping came up quite a lot in the responses. Another topic that is quite frequently raised by environmental professionals, so being stricter with it. Avoiding working in silos, which I think a few people have touched on, but also some technical improvements in the reporting. So having GIS-based assessments and reporting, and having clear and consistent terminology and writing for lay readers with a better sort of narrative. So one question was, what do you think is the ultimate goal really of carrying out an EIA? Ensuring the potential impacts have been appropriately avoided, mitigated, and monitored. Ensuring the project meets the end goal of getting through the planning system and meets the legislative requirements, to drive innovation and improvements in our sector, or all of the above. So nobody thought that driving innovation and improvements is the most important element, but most people thought that all three are quite important, which is quite interesting to see. And of course, ensuring that environmental impacts are avoided, mitigated, and monitored came out as the second most important. Then we kind of broke this down a bit more. What are the most important parts of an EIA? And I think it was fairly even, really. Technical excellence, presentation, and visual impact, with all three being important, but technical excellence coming out on top, followed by presentation, well written, and also followed by visual impacts. Then it was interesting to see what people viewed in their own words as the most important parts of an EIA. And we had quite a broad range of wording coming from people. Proportionality was the key one from the steering group, and accessible was the key one from the wider community. So I thought I would pull these different words into a sort of pool again and find out what is the most important one. And when you group these different words as an exercise, the one that came up on top was a report being accessible. So words that people used were clearly written, clarity of impacts, readable, clarity about the effects, reduce the use of jargon. So there was quite a lot of terminology around that, but a good summary is accessible as the most important aspect. The second most important aspect for people was proportional, which comes up quite often with having proportionate EIAs. A report that's accurate, precise, brevity, and consistent came out as a recommendation, but also at the same time being accurate. So we're setting quite high standards. We want them to not be too long and be concise, but also accurate. The third most important aspect that came up was having a technically robust report. So a report which follows an accepted approach and that would stand up to judicial reviews, and a thorough technical understanding. That was the third most important. The fourth was commitment to mitigation in the report, and having low-cost solutions, succinct mitigation, integrating mitigation into the design. Those were all suggestions for improvement. And the fifth aspect was the visual aspect. So this all fits in with the responses to the earlier questions. So having digital reports, good use of figures, and an interactive report. The one thing that I think wasn't picked up by others, but I think is really important, was having a separate technical report. So if you do have a very technical chapter, having that separate as a backup and having the executive summary of that technical report for the public, but separating it out so it would stand up to a judicial review. And the other really important aspect that wasn't included in any of the responses, but I believe is very important, is the requirement for monitoring during construction and operation, because that's a step that's left out quite often. So we do have a webinar next week in relation to monitoring, because it's quite an important topic, and we can discuss that a bit more. But these were the responses, and I'm happy to share the presentation and the replies with everyone who'd like to have a look at them in more detail.
Smashing. Thank you very much for that. Okay, and we're on to our final presentation now from Sarah Hodgson. Sarah is an Associate Director at Wardle Armstrong. She has significant experience in undertaking climate change EIAs and a particular understanding of nuances and inconsistencies of the methodologies applied by different consultants and the lack of consideration of future climate change impacts within other EIA disciplines. So over to Sarah.
Hi everyone. I will try to be quick because I'm conscious of time. And also there's a lot of things, the principles of what good makes good reporting has always been spoken about, and they all apply to climate change too. But if you'd like to move on to the first slide, please. So climate is measured over a long time frame, usually a period of 30 years, and is the record of general weather conditions in a specific place. This can include rainfall, temperature, snow, wind, or any other weather condition that occurs in a defined region, globally or locally. So good reporting uses the correct terminology. For example, there are some terms which are commonly used interchangeably, but that actually have very different meanings in the context of climate change. So, for example, it's important to understand and be clear about the difference between vulnerability and susceptibility when identifying sensitive receptors to a changing climate. And so very briefly, sensitivity is the degree to which a system will respond to a change in climatic conditions. For example, the extent of change in ecosystem composition, structure, and functioning. Adaptability or resilience is the degree to which adjustments are possible in practices, processes, or system structures to projected or actual changes in climate. Adaptation can be spontaneous or planned and can be carried out in response to or anticipation of climate change. And then vulnerability is the extent to which climate change may damage or harm a system, and it depends on a system's sensitivity and ability to adapt to new climate conditions. So, and it's also very important to understand and be clear about the difference between climate adaptation measures and climate mitigation measures in your reporting. The European Environment Agency definition is that climate adaptation means anticipating the adverse effects of climate change and taking appropriate action to prevent or minimize the damage they can cause, or taking advantage of any opportunities that might arise. And then climate mitigation means making the impacts of climate change less severe by preventing or reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So next slide, please. The climate has complex interactions between multiple systems, including environmental, socio-economic, governance, and infrastructure. Yet with everyone often working within the confines of their own specialisms, the impact and feedbacks of these complex interactions can get lost or forgotten about. So good environmental reporting recognises what the current climate conditions are in a particular location and how receptors act in response now, but it also looks to the future to consider the implications of future climate conditions and how the topic under scrutiny may be affected by those changes. There are many interconnected risks and integrated solutions, which I won't go into detail now, but for example, they include climate and energy, which is one of the most talked about, but it's also climate and nature, and that's everything to do with water, soils, ecology, trees, etc. It's all interconnected. Then you've got climate and human health, that's both physical and mental. Climate and transport, and that includes the transport infrastructure. Climate and air quality and pollution, climate and archaeology, because changing ground conditions may affect how things are preserved. And then also climate and society, which includes culture, social values, local communities, and natural capital. So, sorry. So there is a need to explore interdisciplinary working, knowledge sharing, and applications of systems thinking approaches to address these interlinked crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. So good reporting considers these complex interactions through greater collaborations between teams and across disciplines. It's about breaking down silos to communicate issues and reach appropriate solutions that provide cross benefits to multiple systems and hopefully avoid maladaptation, which is a form of poor adaptation that can create new unforeseen problems or even intensify existing ones. So next slide, please. So what does reporting look like for climate change? Well, some of these types listed here may be familiar to many of you. So this is to highlight the interdisciplinary aspects of good reporting. Climate change should not always be a standalone topic and should be considered by everyone across all technical disciplines as integral rather than as an add-on to reporting. And most of all, a good report needs to be relatable for the reader. So for me, the role of a climate change specialist like myself is to interpret the climate science and future climate scenarios to provide support and input to other specialisms, and also to collate discipline-specific information from others to be able to communicate effectively to reach and engage a wider range of people. So different communication styles may be needed depending on the type of report and its intended purpose. A good report carefully considers the intended target audience when setting out the report structure, presenting the findings visually, and summarising the key takeaways for the reader. Ultimately, each discipline should be considering how future climate change may affect their discipline and how to adapt and/or mitigate these potential likely effects, and feeding this back into the climate change reporting, especially where this is a standalone topic, such as for environmental impact assessments. Next, please. So just very briefly to expand a little bit on what Eleni was saying regarding good EIA reporting. The EIA regulations state that there are two discrete aspects to consider for climate change. The first aspect deals with the impact of the project on climate. This is through the release into the atmosphere of greenhouse gas emissions associated with a project and will require mitigation measures to reduce the impact on global climate. So all projects will generate greenhouse gas emissions at some stage of the development, and so some form of mitigation will be likely to reduce or limit these emissions. And then the second aspect deals with the vulnerability of the project to climate change. This looks at how resilient the local receptors are expected to be without any interventions, how well they can adapt to changing climate conditions, and what adaptation measures or interventions are needed for the site to support these local receptors in future. And a good climate change EIA report collates information from the other topics and is consistent and relevant to the type of project. As for climate change data requirements, that's probably a separate session for another day. So just finally, if you move on to the next slide, please. To quickly summarise, these are my key tips to good reporting from a climate change perspective, and these are intended to complement all of the other basics for what makes good reporting that you've heard today. Climate change will not affect all regions in the same way, and there may be overall trends, but regional climate change may look very different. So, for example, in the UK, East Anglia is set to get much, much drier and experience water scarcity, whereas parts of the southwest is set to get much, much wetter and experience increased flooding from increased precipitation and sea level rise. And that sea level rise from thermal expansion of the waters, not just melting ice caps and glaciers. So there's no one size fits all, and including site-specific data analysis in reporting is really important for climate change. Also, it's good to include examples of actions to reduce or limit greenhouse gas emissions directly or indirectly associated with the project, and includes examples of how resilience to future climate impacts is enhanced for the project. So make it clear, stick to the facts, make it pretty with figures and graphs. And if AI has been used, then be transparent about how and why these tools have been applied. But make sure you interrogate the data sources and include references and make the report relatable for the reader. Thank you.
Smashing. Thank you very much for that. Thanks to all our presenters. Over to Amy, I think now.
Great, thank you everyone. And I think that was a great place to end, kind of wrapping it all up from an interdisciplinary point of view. I can see that we've got one question already around Eleni's slides. So what I will do is just pop my email in the chat. Hopefully everyone can see that. And if you would like the slides, then just get in touch with me and I can make sure that those are shared with you. I think as we start to speak now, if anyone else has other questions, then please do pop them in the Q&A and I can read them out to the panelists. But kind of taking host privileges for a second, I think I will start with a question. And I know a few of the presentations did already touch on this, so hopefully this will be a bit more of a quick fire recap. But I wonder if you could all pull out kind of one key takeaway when you're thinking specifically about big or easy mistakes that you can make when putting together a report. So is there something that that all of the attendees should leave having it in their mind not to do when they're writing a report? I won't put anyone on the spot, so
I'll go first, just in case anyone gets it before me. Time. I think that's the biggest challenge is time. So, and that's associated with planning properly and really thinking through what the report's going to need, who you're going to need to deliver the report, and the killer for most. I can talk from a consultancy point of view. The killer for most things is time. So yeah, that has to be factored in, and add 20-30% contingency onto that, and you'll probably land reasonably close to where you need to be. So
I don't mind sort of following on from that, because it probably relates to a lack of time. Perhaps when these reports are being put together, it's just taking the time to pay attention to the detail and share the information that you have got. That, I think Andy said at the outset, there's lots of good work being done. So take the time to turn that into the content of the report and don't leave stuff out, because if a regulator finds something that's missing or thinks there's something missing, then they will follow up on that. And if it's been done, it just saves a lot of time to communicate it well within that report.
I'll add on to, it sort of comes down to time. It's like building in time to check your input data when it comes from third parties, and just don't assume that that's been through, obviously it comes from your own internal colleagues. It should have gone through QA, but it's always worth doing your own check on what is going into your report. And again, goes back to the consistency point that Sarah was making about making sure that you're using the right data or the most up-to-date data as well.
I'll add to that. Obviously, building on that is quality and governance. So yes, you've got all the checking and reviewing to do, but also, as Sarah's just said, where's that data come from? Is there any assumptions you've had to make on the back of that data? And if you've had to make any assumptions, state them. State what uncertainties there are. And it's really important. Yes, it's based upon this, but this causes a risk. State your risks.
I would say that for me, it's really important to have someone at the end, have enough time for someone at the end who hasn't been involved with the EIA at all, but is an EIA, project manager or coordinator or lead, to read through your report and make sure you haven't missed something and they can understand it properly. Because I think when you end up working on a report for a year and you've read everything 5 times, your mind starts to miss things, and then someone objective will look at it for 1 second and spot mistakes. And I think presentation is really important, because sometimes when I review reports, I'll receive a report that looks like it hasn't been through an internal QA, and things like typos or comment boxes that haven't been deleted or track changes that can really put people off your report. Even if it is a really good report, they'll spot those things. I think presentation and having someone objective to check your report for you at the end is really important.
Yeah, I think all those things are important, what everyone else said. For me, the biggest mistake that I see is incorrect metrics, and that really alters the outcome of the report that you're trying to get across. So just really proofreading and checking and allowing enough time is really, really key.
Great, thank you, everyone, and hopefully that's given attendees a bit of a checklist of what not to do. On to the next set of questions. There's a couple actually that have come up around AI, which I think before this call, all of the speakers kind of predicted would come up, and I know it was mentioned as well at the end of Andrew's introduction. So there's a couple of questions, and you can kind of address it how you'd like to, but a bit around the common reasons that people might be using AI in environmental reporting, and then also a bit more broadly the benefits and challenges of using AI tools for reporting in your experience so far.
I don't mind starting on that. Work that I'm aware is being done with AI is to try and extract information quickly out of lots of analytical results, for example, or huge amounts of borehole log data. I'm not sure how well that's progressed, but I know there's work being done from a land condition perspective on using AI to ease the processing and the utilization of what can be huge amounts of data. And that would be if that could be semi-automated or improved in some way, I'm sure that would be of benefit.
Yeah, I agree. AI is proving quite helpful in that respect in terms of data processing, and just the flip side to that is the bigger the data sets get, just the bar for being robust and having that auditability is rising with it, and just making sure that we as humans can keep up with kind of the amount of data that AI can generate in the first place. With kind of online sensors, the cost of sensors is coming down, so that's kind of going hand in hand with the ability of AI to process that data. We just need to make sure that it's still being put in the right place and at the right time, and that really does only come from kind of having that experience of where might the problems be, but AI could also potentially help us in spotting where that problem is that we might not have thought about. So yeah, working hand in hand, but trying to always keep the upper hand on the artificial side of the intelligence, I think.
Yeah, just to add to what Sarah is saying, like AI is very good for compiling large data sets and analyzing it, helping you to analyze it, but it still needs your technical expertise to interpret that data and sense check it and make sure that the outputs are within what you would expect, and not just to trust that it's correct. And also being clear and transparent in your report on how and when it's been used and what for. Well, we have a company policy that you have to do that in your reports. So
yeah, and I think that just it's also about what you ask AI to do, because in that, and it was a point I was going to make separately, but it's completely related now. Is this concept of confirmation bias when we're looking at? I mentioned about using good quality data and make decisions on good quality data, etc. But confirmation bias is basically favoring information that confirms what you already believe. So you might have preconceived ideas about what the situation is on a site or a project or a conceptual site model. So you've really got to sort of fight against that and let the data inform your decision making. And similarly, perhaps making sure that the questions that you ask AI are fair, so they give a fair and balanced kind of output. So, but yeah, sort of treating with caution anything that comes out of AI is a good start. So,
any final reflections on that one, or should we move on to the next question? I think that's quite a good overview, and I'm sure it's something that is just going to come up more and more, and I'm sure you'll all be getting lots of questions about it in your day-to-day work as well. So next one from an attendee is around communication. So they've noted that it was mentioned across the board as important for good reporting, particularly given the interdisciplinary nature of some of the reports. So they were just asking, how have all of you developed communication skills in this area, and what would you recommend that others could do to start to build those skills?
I can start from the EIA sort of perspective. I'd say I think as an EIA sort of coordinator or project manager, when you're working in that field, communication is really an important skill, and it's quite often something that you learn from mistakes that happen in projects. The key lessons that I've taken through my career is that sometimes teams aren't very honest about their concerns, for example, regarding the program, regarding design assumptions, or regarding the quality of reporting that, for example, a colleague has produced. So I think being honest with your concerns during meetings, whilst not being confrontational, so that you can solve any issues that there are early on in the process. I think quite often people are quite afraid to speak their mind, especially if you're like a younger graduate or you don't feel confident. But being really honest and not confrontational about any risks that you see to the program, quality not being what it should be, or the design changing and that it's not very clear, being really honest with your own team is really important. And also making sure that you send out the design information to all the specialists at the same time, so that, like the noise, traffic, and air teams are all updated at the same time with changes to the design, or that the landscape, the ecology, and the heritage team also know that the visual impact's completely changed. And I think if you're the holder of that information, you have to make sure you disseminate that information to everybody. Don't just give it to one person or one team. Everyone should have it together, so you don't end up with different versions of designs being assessed. Those are the two key things, I think.
I can share a kind of a bit of a journey that I went on working on lots of brownfield sites, which are, again, quite emotive locations. And that really did kind of challenge me when I started, in terms of I think I mentioned it in my lightning presentation, was you're often working with people who can be quite well informed. They might actually have far more time than you do to look into, a peak in air quality that's happened, but sometimes they can also be misinformed. So whatever your response is going to be to monitoring data or, modeling output is, don't rush it. Don't shy away from uncertainty and anomalies. It's better to face them head on and say, there is uncertainty about what may have caused this. That might feel uncomfortable to not be able to give an answer, but it does build trust in the long term, and you can sort of then work on that. In terms of trying to interpret complex data, a picture can tell 1,000 words, but only if it's high quality. A good figure can replace lots and lots of text, but if it's cluttered and people can't see necessarily where their houses are, it can sometimes do more harm than good. So again, don't rush things out. And transparency is just really important. Don't pretend certainty. Don't be too optimistic about, if things were bad last month, that they're going to get better because you've spoken to the contractor, or, you've been promised something will happen to improve things. Only write about kind of what you have control over. And if that's only your professional judgment of how you interpret the data, then don't overpromise is one thing I learned.
One aspect of that question as well was developing that communication skill in a given area, and I think how you can sort of develop that. And I think hopefully, if you're working in an office environment, then try and listen to colleagues. If it's in a written form, see how other people are managing that, learn from other people's experience, but also put yourself out there and start to have those conversations. So from a regulator's point of view, perhaps don't be afraid to pick up the phone to a regulator and have a discussion about an issue that's perhaps being questioned or something, because provided we've got time, we're more than happy to talk about that sort of thing, because the ultimate goal for both parties is to get a solution that everyone's happy with and development can progress and what have you. So I think just try and observe, and take stuff in by sort of osmosis, but also don't be afraid to, have those conversations.
From my experience, obviously there's all different types of communication. So like if you're writing an email, people don't tend to read long, complicated, waffly emails. So if you keep it as short as you can, keep it concise, and if there's action points, make sure you make that really clear what you're expecting of people, so that you can really engage the other end, and open that dialogue. And also don't be afraid to check back in, and as David was saying, pick up the phone, because quite often that can resolve issues within 10 minutes rather than within 3 weeks of back and forth email ping pong. So don't be afraid to talk to people, to develop your skills. Like there's no right or wrong, as long as you're not rude, then most people don't mind you asking questions.
Lovely, thanks everyone. I'll take that pause to mean that's kind of all of your reflections on that one. We've got a few more reflections in the chat box. Someone's noted, which might be valuable for other people as well, that they've encountered over the years a lot of unchecked use of copy and paste in report writing. As much as it's okay to use standard methods and criteria, and they might be appropriate to reuse across projects, it's really important to check that you're actually reading the content that you're copying and pasting, and not putting something completely irrelevant into a new report when it's actually about something completely different. So I think that's a really good point to raise.
It's a really good one, and something that trips us up, in our internal QA sometimes, is that you spot, someone's copied and pasted, say, the criteria, but actually if you're doing a project in Scotland, they will have different air quality criteria. It's something we come up, this kind of, the devolved administrations have now got their own air quality legislation. It's something we just need to keep an eye on ourselves. So really good point, Jamie.
Yeah, from a regulator's point of view, it's one of those things that we see more often than we'd like, and it goes to that trust issue from going forward with that. If you see that in the first report, then straight away you're thinking, well, hang on here, we're going to have to pay particular attention anyway, but we're going to have to keep a particularly close eye on it, and it puts you slightly on a back foot at the outset of a project, which isn't really where you want to be.
I agree. I think that's the classic error that you find when you look at a report and you're reviewing it. You're bound to find a reference to a different site or a different project that just made its way in there. And I think it really puts you off a report, and you do lose trust, as you said, David. When you open a report and you see reference to another project, it really puts you off that report, and you don't trust it as much. So if you are the author that's copied another chapter to work on, before you even send it to be checked internally, you should treat your own chapter and the person you're sending it to as an external. So don't just say, oh, it's my own team, they'll pick up. Like, you look at it as it's going to an external person that is going to judge you on the quality of the report, and maybe do like a word search for the last project you worked on. To pick up references to X project that you might have missed.
And I'll just take that one step further. It is not just like previous projects, but making sure that it's relevant to the type of the project. So we work on quarries, housing projects, renewable energy projects. And when reviewing project reports, I sometimes see housing projects that refer to like mining and like plant. And you just got to be clear that what you're writing about is actually what you're writing about.
Yeah. Someone said to me once, it takes 4 good actions to make up for 1 bad action. So you really just don't want to leave. And it's totally natural that these things, you do copy and paste from, or you do pick up an old report, like everyone knows that, but just don't let it get out. So it's going to take a lot of extra work to recover from that.
Great. I think, much like AI use, it's one of those things that might seem like a good idea to save a bit of time, and then actually you end up spending double the amount going back over it in the end. So There's still a couple of questions, but I think unfortunately that's going to have to be it for today because we're approaching the end of our slot. But first of all, a huge thank you to all of our speakers for presenting today. There's such a good insight into the considerations that you should have when writing reports, as well as plenty of things not to do when writing them as well. So I'm sure all of our attendees will be able to leave today with lots to take forward into their own work. So attendees, thank you for logging in. Aware it was a long session with lots of information, but I hope, like I said, that you've got a benefit from it and you've found it really informative as well. Don't forget, if you are an IES member, to log your attendance at this webinar in the IES CPD tool. And if you're not a member, I hope you will consider joining us. This webinar has been recorded, so it will be put up on the IES website and on our YouTube channel. If you're watching this recording on YouTube, please do subscribe to the channel, like this video, and if you click on the little bell icon, you'll be notified when we share new content. So to wrap that all up, thank you again to all of our speakers today for giving up your time and sharing all of that knowledge with us. And thanks to all of the attendees for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.